identity crisis, quote unquote, and might ask themselves who they are in this sense. And in the philosophical debate, here are a few examples where it arises. One is about this debate about authenticity and the ideal of authenticity, which authors like Charles Taylor have famously written about. So Taylor, in this book, The Ethics of Authenticity, which is already more than 40 years old, was making the case that our modern era was largely defined by this ideal of living an authentic life, finding who one really is, and then trying to be true to who one really is, that this was the way to a meaningful life or a good life, as opposed to, say, a life of just mindless conformity or seeking outside of oneself some standards for how to shape one's life. And I think he makes quite a good case in this book that this is at least an influential ideal of the good life in the times we're living in. Then you have this debate that I've worked on for a while, this debate on the ethics of neuro-interventions, quote unquote, and also neuro-enhancement, so the use of all kinds of different interventions that directly affect brain functioning, from antidepressants to brain stimulation, and then more futuristic, at the more speculative level, you have the sort of things that Elon Musk and others want to do, put chips into our brain to somehow improve our functioning. And there's been a lot of discussion there as well about whether that would present threats to who a person is, or identity, again, in the sense that interests me here. Now, to say a few more words about that, and also about the normative force of identity in this context, I think it's fair to say that it would not be plausible to say that if an intervention changes who someone is in this sense, that means the intervention is impermissible, and it's a knockdown argument against it. I think that would be implausible. That would mean, for instance, that all forms of self-improvement are immoral or unethical, which sounds very implausible, right? So the notion of identity can't have this kind of normative weight, although some authors sometimes seem to imply that it does. And that might be because of a confusion between different senses of identity, as I'll touch on later. But I think the notion of identity here, its weight is more, I guess, more modest. It's more a matter of identifying when someone's change is a big deal or not. There seems to be, when a feature is taken to be part of someone's identity in this sense, typically there's the assumption that it's a significant change, something that cannot be taken lightly if the person changes one aspect of their identity. And maybe that means that there needs to be stronger grounds or a stronger justification for this type of change, as opposed to, as we'll see, if someone is taken to change something that's peripheral, right? One of the key contrasts here is going to be central features versus peripheral features. And I think the same can be said about some of these dilemmas that Taylor touches on, which is finding who one is as sort of looking to that as a guide to how one ought to live. There are certainly limitations to that as well, right? If I somehow identify that I have then a propensity towards extreme cruelty towards others, it does not seem plausible to say, well, that's what I should organize my life around. I should go around trying to torture animals or other people for fun. So clearly, identity again can be have this kind of decisive normative force, but nonetheless, it seems that in many cases people think it does have some force, right? Say if someone finds out that they are transgender, comes to the conclusion that this is part of who they are, well, many people will say then maybe you should, right? Maybe you should consider sex reassignment surgery, or you should change your way of life and your presentation to reflect how you feel inside, the way Kathleen Jenner did, for example. So again, there seems to be, at least in many cases, some normative force that people attach to the notion. And the final debate that it might be worth mentioning here is discussions of moral responsibility. So as we'll see, many authors who talk about identity in relation to this idea of central features, they also think that it relates to the idea of responsibility. And that seems to be because there's an assumption that if some feature is part of who you are, if it's a central aspect of who you are, you might be more responsible for the actions that this feature might generate than if it were something more like aberrant or peripheral. And the related notion here is this idea of a deep self, a view of responsibility. That's what I've just described, the idea that some features are more truly yours than others, they define you more authentically than others. And these features are part of your deep self, and if one of your actions stems from some aspect of your deep self, then you are more responsible for it. Maybe you deserve greater praise or greater blame, depending on the case, than if it were, as I've said, sort of aberrant aspect. So these are some of the relevant debates that appeal to this notion. All right. Now, what do I call the standard framing of the debate about identity? Well, it's a conceptual framework that is owes a lot to philosopher Maria Schechtman, who published this book in 1996 called The Constitution of Selves, where she laid out this framework, I think, for the first time in much detail. And she has popularized this understanding of identity as narrative identity. That's the way many people now refer to it. I prefer to speak of individual identity. The reason being that narrative identity already suggests a specific account of what identity is supposed to be or how we're supposed to understand it, which I think is not a convincing account. It's a very influential approach, but I believe it is mistaken. So I prefer individual identity because it's more neutral. But I mean, it's not essential. This is mostly a linguistic, verbal point. But one thing that's important is to distinguish this sense of identity from what's known as a numerical identity. So a numerical identity is the sense of identity that's been really at the center of philosophical debates about personal identity, right, through the centuries already. So if you think of Derek Parfit, for example, and Reasons and Persons, he talks a lot about personal identity there, but he doesn't talk so much about individual identity. He's interested in numerical identity, namely the criteria that explain our persistence through time as one and the same individual, right? What is it that makes me, assuming there is such a thing as numerical identity, assuming it's not just an illusion as some thing like the Buddhist, then what is it that grounds it? What is it that makes it the case that Alex Erler a year ago is the same individual as Alex Erler today, despite the qualitative changes that occurred? And you might know there's various accounts of this that have been proposed. Some think it's a matter of psychological continuity through time with your previous or future self. Some think it's more a matter of physical continuity. Say, maybe you are still the same biological organism, or you still have the same brain or enough of the same brain as your former self. So there's all these different accounts. That's not the sense of identity that I'm discussing here. Although it seems that individual identity presupposes numerical identity, as I think David Shoemaker has argued. I think that is correct. If we want to say someone has changed their individual identity, we are usually assuming, well, it's the same individual numerically. He or she is the same individual, but the content of their individual identity has changed. By the way, if anything is really unclear, feel free to jump in and let me know. I guess for the more substantial, discussions, we can wait for the second part. But if anything is unclear, feel free to ask for clarification. So Cheshman frames the debate as follows. She says that if we think about individual or narrative identity, we're looking for an answer to what she calls the characterization question. And this question, she writes in this same book, it asks which characteristics are truly those of some person, as opposed, say, to those which are his as a result of hypnosis, brainwashing, or some other form of coercion. And she also says in the same chapter that these characteristics are somehow central to who the person is. These are the attributes that make someone the person she is. And so a useful criterion of whether some feature is part of someone's identity might be to ask whether altering that feature would make her a different person in an important sense, distinct from the sense of numerical identity, right? We're not asking whether changing this feature would destroy the person. We're assuming that no, the person keeps existing, but would this change her individual identity, make her a different person in some other important sense? So the features that constitute individual identity, assuming that this notion also makes sense, some people are skeptical about that. I think it does make sense to speak of features that are central as opposed to more peripheral. I personally don't believe that it's just a matter of personal preference. It seems that I expect that there would be quite a bit of intersubjective agreement in various cases, right? Say things like personality traits, for example, will strike most people as being good candidates for being central features, whereas, I don't know, my desire to scratch my right ear on the 3rd of February in 2010 will typically not be viewed as central. It would be strange to say, oh, this defines who I am. It's a particular fleeting desire. So I'm going to assume that we shouldn't be skeptics about identity in either of these two senses. But of course one could dispute that. That would be a debate for another day. And I'm happy to discuss that more in the question time if you're interested. But so basically this is Cheshman's framing. She says there's this characterization question which talks about attributability, whether some feature is truly attributable to a person, and she says it's also about centrality. The features that are truly attributable to us are also our central features. And they're both covered by this particular question, which she distinguishes from what she calls the re-identification question. And this question, she says, is more tied to the idea of numerical identity. I think that probably she should have talked about, or that we should talk about the persistence question rather than re-identification, because re-identification seems to refer to an epistemological question, right? It seems to ask how do I re-identify a person through time? How do I know that you are still the same individual that you were yesterday, numerically? How do I tell that? But that's clearly distinct from the metaphysical question of what makes you the same, right? It could be that the two criteria happen to coincide, but they might not, right? If you think that it's the persistence of your brain that grounds your numerical identity through time, then it doesn't seem that this is going to be my criterion for re-identifying you, right? I'm typically not going to use your brain scans to figure out, oh yes, that's still you. So that's why I think we should talk about persistence rather than re-identification, but that's a small point. Shechtman has her own account of identity, having framed the debate the way I've outlined. She offers her own account, which is called the narrative self-constitution view. So it's, as its name indicates, it's focused on this idea of a narrative, and more specifically, she argues that the features that make you the particular person you are those that are featured in your own self-narrative. So in your own inner story, you're telling yourself about yourself. That's the basic idea. Although she adds some constraints to that. So one constraint, for example, is that your self-narrative should not be completely detached from reality. Someone who were delusional, someone who thought that they were, I don't know, Napoleon or Confucius, who still, had survived through the millennia, that clearly that self-narrative would not define who they were, according to Shechtman. Shechtman doesn't want to have an account that implies this. So that's where this reality constraint comes in and says, well, this person's self-narrative is out of touch with basic facts about reality, such as the fact that we can't live for thousands of years. So there's going to be a few constraints that need to be met. But still, the person's self-narrative has this special priority and authority according to her view. Now, it's worth noting that in a more recent book that she published in 2014, Shechtman does recognize that there are limits or shortcomings to her framing. So the framing that I've mentioned about the characterization question being defining, helping us identify which features define who someone is, and also being tied to this idea of proper attributability, which in turn might relate to this idea of a deep self and moral responsibility. She says, I now think that this is far too simple. So that's quite, that's a big concession, and I believe it's justified. I think she deserves credit for recognizing that. Nevertheless, well, for one thing, I don't think she has proposed a new framework that would make up for those shortcomings. And for another thing, her original framework remains very influential in contemporary discussions of identity. So if you take some books that were published over the past 20 years on these issues, so this book by David de Gracia, Human Identity and Bioethics, he pretty much borrows Shechtman's entire framework with a few modifications, but he says, there's this characterization question, identity is about this question, and it's defined by someone's self-narrative, and so on. They're very close to Shechtman's view. There are other authors like Nada Grigorov with this book, Neuroethics and the Scientific Revision of Common Sense, who also touched on these issues and she talks about neurointerventions and identity. She also adopts Shechtman's framing, although not her account of identity. She doesn't endorse this particular narrative approach, but she still talks about identity in terms of the characterization question and so on. And many other authors do the same. It has really shaped the landscape in those discussions. So what I want to do in this paper is to challenge this standard framing and try to offer what I think is a helpful alternative. And I basically want to argue that we need a finer grained distinctions here if we want to think more rigorously about these issues. So for one thing, I think one distinction we need to make is between two different questions, what I call the centrality question and the attributability question. Or to put it differently, we need to distinguish issues of centrality of a particular feature and issues of attributability or proper attributability. And a key reason for that is that I think, on the one hand, it seems that central attributes of a person can sometimes be ones that are inimical to moral responsibility or autonomy. So take conditions like addiction, or perhaps mental disorders like bipolar disorder. So it's clear that these issues are challenges somewhat can limit or even undermine a person's autonomy or moral responsibility. But it still seems that we could say that in some cases, when they're sufficiently pervasive in a person's life, that they become part of who that person is, if the person can't rid themselves of addiction to drugs, for example, or some other type of addiction, alcoholism. It seems possible to say that this becomes part of who they are, I would suggest. And in that case, that means we have a divergence here between centrality and attributability. And the same in the opposite direction. It seems that there are motives excuse me, that are not central to who someone is, but that could still fully ground moral responsibility for an act. Say, if I have a one-off desire to scratch my right ear, and I proceed to do that, it seems that I am fully responsible for my action. But as I've suggested, it would seem strange to say, well, that this desire now defines who I am, or is part of my identity, or is central. So I think we should distinguish these questions, and I would say that the question that's related to individual identity is the centrality question, and the question of attributability relates to this idea of the deep self. What is someone's deep self? And these are different issues, I would argue. And just speaking of this characterization question as encompassing both these sets of issues, I think muddies the waters here and can lead to confusion, like unnecessary confusion. So that's one first distinction that I think we ought to make. Here's another one. I have, in fact, quite a series of them. So the second one I would advocate is between broad and narrow forms of these two questions. So let's take this, what I call the centrality question. I would say that there's a broad form in which this question asks, it asks us to give a complete list of the central features of a particular individual X. So if I had to pick someone, I don't know, let's take some celebrity like Serena Williams, the tennis player. If I had to answer this broad centrality question about her, I would have to offer an exhaustive list of features that can properly be said to be central to who she is. And I'm not sure what exactly that list would look like, but presumably would include things like some of her personality traits, the fact that she's a very competitive person, a very resilient person with a strong fighting spirit, and perhaps some other less flattering properties like being prone to emotional outbursts in certain circumstances and so on. But I would have this long list. And there are features where maybe we could debate whether they should be on the list or not, like the fact that she's African American. Is that a central feature? Is that part of her identity? I'm not sure. Well, I think, let's say I would be sympathetic to saying yes, but you might note that then this particular property seems to be an essential property. So. We could say yes, that if she were not African American, she would be a different person, but that's because it seems to be that our ethnicity is an essential property of who we are. It's not something we could change and remain numerically the same. So then there's this question there about the role of essential properties in individual identity. But at least it seems I could give, regarding any person, it seems I could come up with an approximation of such a list, even though we might always doubt whether the list is exhaustive or whether we could always debate whether this or that property truly belongs there. But then I could also ask this question in a narrow form, which is, I could ask the question about one specific feature. Is this feature F a central part of Serena Williams, or is it just peripheral? So that's what I call the narrow centrality question. And then when it comes to attributability, I think we have a similar distinction between a question, the broad version, which asks which features are properly attributable to this person and therefore ground moral responsibility when she acts upon those features, when they move her to act. And then the narrow version would ask whether a particular feature F is properly attributable to that person. That's another distinction that I think needs to be made. Here's a third one. Hopefully I won't tire you too much with these distinctions. But I think there are good reasons to make all of them for the sake of clarity and rigor. So this third distinction is about questions and meta-questions. They apply to both questions about centrality and questions about attributability. So the centrality meta-question, as I define it, it basically asks how should we answer the centrality question about someone? Or to put it differently, what is it that makes certain features central and others just peripheral? What's our criteria? That's what this question asks. And I think, again, this is more helpful than just talk about the characterization question the way Sheshman initially proposed. Because if we use her framework, then we will end up just talking about the characterization question, how to answer the characterization question about a particular individual, say. And but she also says that her own narrative self-constitution view provides an answer to the characterization question. And then it seems we're not sure any longer what question we're talking about, right? Strictly speaking, accounts of individual identity seek to answer this centrality meta-question. They aim to tell us what is it that makes some features central and others peripheral. They don't purport, say, to offer a list of central features of some particular person. But if we just say, we just have this idea of a characterization question to work with, then we can't really refer to these different endeavors using different labels. Then there's something similar for the attributability issue. That there's an attributability meta-question which asks us, how do we identify properly attributable features of a person? What is it that makes some features, or what is it that makes some features properly attributable? That's the attributability meta-question as opposed to the more specific questions that bear on specific individuals. And it seems that these meta-questions should be answered first, right? If I want to be able to answer, say, the broad centrality question about someone, it would help if I had an answer to the centrality meta-question. It would help if I knew what is it that makes some features central and others not. Because then I can apply this criterion to this particular person, and I can come up with a list of central features. Okay, here's another distinction which I think we need to make here. And that's the distinction between the notions of centrality and salience. So that's meant to reflect the fact that there is some ambiguity in when we ask who is someone, or if we ask to characterize a person. So the question about salience is basically, once again here I think there's a broad and a narrow version, and in the broad version, this question asks us to describe someone in terms of qualities that are salient in this particular context. And the narrow version asks us whether some particular feature is a salient feature of that person in that context. The idea here is that this question about salience is much more susceptible, or the proper answer to that question is going to be much more susceptible to contextual variation than a question about centrality. Now, it is possible to say that the centrality question or questions is a subset of this broader question about salience. It's one particular version of it, which is basically a question about salience that is asked in a context where we're interested in the central features of someone. Maybe that's what the centrality question is. The salience question asked in that particular, with that particular interest in mind. But this means that there's going to be contextual variation between answers, proper answers to the salience question. That's not going to be found, in my opinion, among proper answers to the centrality question. So to clarify this, right, to make this clearer, well, consider this. Consider we ask a question like, who is Albert Einstein? Or I guess, who was Albert Einstein? Today might be more appropriate, but let's imagine someone in the 1920s asking that question about Einstein. Well, clearly the proper answer to that question is going to be different if the person who asks it is someone who has been invited to a formal dinner, and they're going to be sitting next to Einstein. They're going to have to talk to him for the entire duration of the dinner. Then they might want to know specific things about him. They might want to know presumably what kind of person he is, how he is to relate to or talk to. So a proper answer to this question to such a person in that context will emphasize, say, his personality traits. Whereas if someone asks the same question using the same formula about Einstein, but their goal was to write an encyclopedia entry about him, it seems that the salient features in that context would be different, right? Presumably his scientific accomplishments would be much more relevant or salient, and maybe his personality traits would be relevant as well, but much less so. So context is going to make very big differences here. Also, depending on, for instance, what the particular interests of the person asking the question are. But I would say that the same is not true of if we ask about a question about centrality. What are the central features of Einstein? What are the features that he would have been a different person if he had lost them or changed them? I don't think that this varies from context to context. We can debate that, but that is my claim. Here's another illustration of this distinction. There are qualities of a person that most of us would consider salient. For instance, salient enough to be mentioned in their biography, but that does not mean that these features are central parts of the person. Again, in the way that I've defined it at the beginning, it doesn't mean that if this person didn't have those qualities, she would be a different person in any significant sense. And here we can consider this example. So this is a famous photograph from 1936 called Migrant Mother, which was the photographer is called Dorothea Lange, and it's a very famous, iconic photograph which illustrates the hardships of the Great Depression. And the subject of that photograph, in this, which is featured in the picture, is Florence Owen Thompson. And now if you ask what Florence Owen Thompson is known as, or if you had a biography of Florence Owen Thompson, you will definitely have as a salient fact the fact that she's the subject of this photograph. So it's a salient property of function. But is it also a central property? I think it may not be, right? I mean, in fact, intuitively it doesn't seem to be. If Florence-Owen function had not been caught in that photograph, had not become the subject of the photograph, she could still have been the same person that she would otherwise that she ended up being. And we can see, for instance, I think we can see this by considering the fact that it makes sense to say that she remained the same despite having been the subject of that photograph, that she didn't change as a person. It is conceivable or coherent to suppose that she might never have learned about the fact that she was featured in the photograph. We could imagine an alternative history in which being featured in the photograph had no impact on her personal life. And then surely she would not have become a different person as a result of being the subject of that photograph. In other words, that property of hers is salient in the context, say, context of writing Florence Thompson's biography, but it's not a part of who she was. It's not part of her identity. That's my argument. And so that's why we need to make this distinction. And finally, that's the final distinction I'll leave you with. It's a distinction between different senses of this question, who am I? I think we need to note that who am I is an ambiguous question. So I've said I think one sense of this question has to do with identity, individual identity and centrality, but it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to this issue. When people raise that question, they sometimes have other questions in mind. Then they just use the same formulation. So here are other possible translations of this question. How do I think of myself? Right? Who am I? What's my own conception of myself? What sort of features do I think are most important to who I am? Or maybe which traits of mine do I value or endorse? Or sometimes it could mean, what do I stand for? What are my commitments? What kind of person I am in terms of the commitments I'm pursuing? Do I stand for democracy, freedom, or against war or poverty, or something like this? I think people might sometimes raise those questions by using this phrase. And if they do that, then it seems clear that the first person perspective will need to be given some priority, right? Simply because if the question is, well, how do I think of myself? I am actually asking what the content of my own perspective of myself is. So therefore, by definition, my own perspective has to have priority, if that's the question I'm raising. And similarly, if I'm asking what I stand for, what commitments I have, or what commitments am I choosing to take up? Again, if to the extent that I'm the person making the decision, my first-person perspectives will have priority. So this is, I think, all accurate, but where I want to disagree with authors like David de Gracia is that I don't think that this is true of the centrality question. So I don't think it's true of questions about identity. I see no reason to privilege the first-person perspective if the question is raised to ask about what my central features are. And one reason for this is, I'll come back to later, the possibility of what I call self-blindness. I'll say a few more words about that shortly. One question that might be raised here that might be worth addressing briefly is whether I am correct when I said that questions about salience are context-dependent, can vary, the proper answer can vary depending on the context, but that this is not true of the centrality question. So there are authors who would disagree with me. So for instance, Amélie Rorty and David Wong wrote this paper on called Aspects of Identity and Agency in 1990, where they offer an interesting account of identity. which might be described as contextualist in nature. Basically what they do is that they say identity is a collection of central traits. Which traits are central? Well, they offer 7 different dimensions under which traits can be central. I won't list them all here. Some examples include what they call objective ramification. So that's the degree to which a trait, to which other traits depend on the trait you're assessing. There's also social ramification. To what extent does the trait affect other people's perception of oneself or the way they treat us? There's also the importance that one gives to the trait, the degree to which one would view oneself as changed if one were to change the trait. This is a third dimension, and so on. But their basic idea is that if you ask, is this trait central to who I am or not, you're never going to get just one answer. You can't just get one answer. All you can say is, well, this trait may be central according to dimension 1, but maybe not according to the dimension 5. And you can't have sort of an absolute assessment. Now, I don't think that's convincing. I think this centrality question can admit of a single correct answer. I think Rorty and Wong are correct that in a number of cases, people choose to emphasize what they call one dimension of centrality or another to answer this question. So the example they give is someone who's running a politician, and they say, well, the campaign of that politician might choose to emphasize different aspects of this person's identity depending on what their specific goals are. Say during when first selecting a candidate to run for office, and then when it's actually time to run for office, they might emphasize different qualities based on different dimensions of centrality. And I think they're certainly right that there's this strategic aspect which is often at play when people talk about someone's identity. But nonetheless, I think that should not affect how we understand centrality. I don't think we should view this essentially as just a matter of strategy to achieve specific goals, right? We want an account that's neutral in this regard. That's not just trying to persuade people, say, to pursue some political agenda or other, or if someone has a conflicted identity, we want an account that's neutral. We don't want to say, well, if the question is, well, is being gay part of this person's identity, then the answer should not depend on whether I think that homosexuality is immoral or not, and then I'm going to just decide that, based on that, whether or not this is a central feature of who that person is. So here I would diverge from Rorty and Wong, although I do think that some degree of pluralism about identity might be defensible. One reason being that there's room for reasonable disagreement in many cases about whether some feature is a central aspect of who someone is. For instance, because we may not know enough about the person to answer that question with confidence. But still, that doesn't mean that there is no truth of the matter in those cases of uncertainty. There could also be cases of indeterminacy. That I think I am open to that. I'm not going to go into that further. Now, this is the final part of my talk, and this is something that I guess I hesitated to include into the paper because my initial goal in the paper was to challenge the standard framing, as I've called it, which I have just done. But then I do have my own positive account of centrality, and in the comments I've received on this paper, some have suggested to me that I should present it as part of the paper to show not just my negative, sort of critical contribution to this debate, but what is also the positive counterpart. So here are just a few words about the approach that I favor. I think that what makes certain features central to who someone is rests on three fundamental conditions. So I would suggest that a feature is a central aspect of who someone is if the person really does have that feature, so it's a real feature of a person. It's distinctive, namely it allows to pick out the person from others to some degree. That doesn't mean that it has to be unique, but it has to be somewhat distinctive, it has to single out the person from at least a number of other people. And finally, this feature needs to have what I'll refer to as a direct psycho-behavioral impact on the person. That is to say, the feature has to make some kind of trait-like difference to their mental life and their behavior. And it has to do that in what we consider a sufficiently direct way. We could debate exactly what counts as sufficiently direct, but the idea here is that there are properties of people that might be both real and distinctive that nevertheless have an overly indirect psycho-behavioral impact, and so we would not usually call them, part of who someone is or part of one's identity. So consider, for example, this famous example of Phineas Gage, the American railroad worker who had this metal rod that went through his skull as a result of an explosion, and then had, his personality reportedly changed significantly afterwards because of the brain injury that he suffered on this occasion. I think it's safe to say that this accident changed who Phineas Gage was as a person. He became a different person in the non-numerical sense. And so some parts of his identity were changed. But I don't think we would want to say that, his decision to pick up a hammer at a specific point in time was part of his identity, even though this may be a feature that was real and distinctive and had some psycho-behavioral consequences, because we can imagine that this desire to pick up this hammer at a specific point in time made it the case that he placed himself in the trajectory of this metal rod, and if he hadn't had this desire, maybe he would not have been hit, right? We don't want to say that this is a central part of who he was. So that's where the directness condition comes in. So this is like my approach in a nutshell. I think it has various advantages. One of them is I think that it develops some of the strongest insights of accounts like Rorty and Wong without the less convincing points that such an account, that their account, for example, involves. It avoids what I would call the problem of incompleteness or self-blindness that accounts that prioritize the first-person perspective are facing. So if we think of the approach, which is very, maybe the dominant one in the literature of Shechtman or de Gracia, for example, who say that your identity is somehow filtered through your own self-narrative. Well, that makes it impossible for you, by definition, to be blind to some aspects of who you are. You must somehow be aware of all your central features. But I would say that surely it's possible to be unaware of some central aspects of who we are. It's possible to lack self-awareness and have some character traits, either good or bad, that we don't know we have. And I think a plausible account of centrality should make for that possibility. But if we prioritize the first-person perspective, it seems we will not be able to do that. In the Constitution of Shechtman somehow tries to get around this problem by distinguishing between explicit and implicit self-narratives, which I think leads to other problems, because basically she ends up with some kind of theory according to which everything is a self-narrative. Like personality traits might be a self-narrative, with almost like it seems we're overreaching, in my opinion, there. Right? It sounds like, just jokingly, it's a bit like, I think, was it Derrida who said everything is a text, and for Sheschman, everything is a self-narrative. I think it's not very, very convincing. And as I've said, I think we need to distinguish centrality from salience, including salience to the person herself. I think that helps us avoid counterexamples. And yeah, I would say my account is descriptive rather than prescriptive, in the sense that I think that this is a plausible way of capturing what features of a person are central, but it doesn't mean that this is, for instance, how people should think of themselves. I think this is sometimes a jump that people make, that if someone provides an account of what features are central, that implies that we should all think of ourselves as having those features, and that this is somehow oppressive or closes down alternative possibilities. I'm not committing myself to the claim that if some feature is central, we have to think of ourselves. We have ourselves to think of it as being central to who we are. Maybe sometimes slightly overestimating ourselves could be desirable, all things considered. Maybe sometimes some lack of self-awareness could have merits. A person is less self-conscious. That's all open, I would say. So that's why this should not be viewed as necessarily a prescriptive account. So that's basically it. I've argued that we need an alternative to the standard framing. I've tried to sketch what this alternative might be. I appreciate that some might advocate skepticism about notions like individual identity or the deep self. And I think these are views that are worth grappling with, but that would be a debate for another occasion. What I think we can say is that as long as we don't have good reasons, compelling reasons to be skeptical about these notions, and I don't think we are, then the distinctions I propose, I think, are important. And I think that debates about authenticity and self-acceptance, and also about neuroenhancements, for example, they're mostly focused on the centrality meta question and the narrow centrality question. So these are the ones that should be answered to address those debates properly, but there can also be issues about attributability and salience. So for example, we could ask whether the use of some neurointervention diminishes moral responsibility in a person by affecting the deep self. That could be part of a discussion. But nevertheless, it's important to distinguish that from the whole debate about centrality. So that's it. I look forward to your comments. Thanks for your attention.